Thanks, Phil. Well, for more on the recent banking scandals, we are joined tonight by Wallace Turbeville, who has worked both as an investment banker at Goldman Sachs and has written numerous reports on financial reform, including the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act. He is currently a senior fellow at Demos, a think tank in the U.S. Thanks for joining us tonight, Wallace.
Thanks very much for having me.
So we got the news today. A couple of people are being arrested for Standard Chartered for the money laundering scandal there. But overall, we're seeing that very few people are behind bars for a lot of the scandals at the big banks. Why is that?
Well, there's I think a lot of it has to do with how far prosecutors are willing to go. If an organization is indicted in this country, you lose the ability to do a lot of business, lose the ability sometimes to do business in the United States, could lose your charter. So I know that there were internal discussions between the Justice Department and the Fed and control of the currency and perhaps Treasury about just how far they could go on HSBC, for instance. And I think there's a concern about pursuing the prosecutorial direction, what it might do to the whole economy.
Okay, so in other words, another situation too big to fail. Absolutely. I mean, that's the whole idea of what regulation is about. I mean, Dodd-Frank particularly, to try to stop firms from becoming too big to fail. Is it safe to say at this point regulation has not been effective?
Well, it's been effective in changing the behavior of the banks to some extent, and will be. The question is whether it will be effective to actually bringing appropriate punishment where punishment is due, and I think that's the public wants that. I just did I was at a conference at University of Maryland called "Too Big to Jail," just on this subject. And while the behaviors that the banks might change, that's a good thing. People want to see proper retribution, I think.
And the fact that we're seeing a string of scandals at several of the banks, is this a question of banks just behaving worse than ever, or is it a question of regulation is just now finding these issues and tackling them? It's a backlog, basically, of what the regulators should have been doing years ago.
Yeah, well, I was on Wall Street at Goldman Sachs in the 80s and 90s, and there was some bad behavior then as well. Nonetheless, with the kinds of mega profits with banks, the financial sector now is something like a third of all profits in the United States, close to 10% of GDP. It's basically doubled in the last 20, 30 years. What's happened is that the amount of profit is freed people up, if you will, and given them the sense that they have an entitlement to behave badly. And I think that's for certain a big part of this is that around the world, banks and bankers believe that they can behave in ways that are beyond control. And
well, one of the outcomes has been that confidence among, for example, U.S. People is at the lowest it's been in terms of confidence in the banks. What effect does that have on the whole financial system if a vast majority of people don't trust banks?
Well, ultimately, the question is in terms of share prices, that sort of thing. I think that ultimately people are going to go with the financial sector as it makes sense for them. The lack of trust that people have in banks is a concern, and is a concern in the sense that historically, when things go wrong, bankers get punished, and that's part of the deal for being a banker. You get to make a lot of money, and you get punished when things go wrong. J.P. Morgan in 1907 and thereafter, he was the only guy that got punished for the panic, even though he saved the country. So I think that the continuing negativism of people could yield even more regulation than we have now.
Okay, so we'll have to see what happens if that regulation is effective in the future. Wallace, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
That was Wallace Turbeville. He's the senior fellow at Demos in New York.